The knife of moonlight cut through the tall windows of Draven Hall, and Lyra Ashworth's heart slammed against her ribs as her fingers closed around cold metal. The crown. She actually had it. For one wild second, triumph flooded through her chest, sharp and bright, before a hand clamped down on her shoulder like a steel trap. "Got you," a rough voice growled behind her. Lyra spun, the crown still clutched to her chest, and found herself staring into the broad face of a palace guard, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. Around them, the private display chamber, usually silent and reverent, suddenly filled with the sound of running boots. "It was a joke," she said quickly, backing toward the window she had climbed through only minutes before. "I was going to put it back before sunrise. I swear it." The guard did not look convinced. Two more guards burst through the double doors, torches raised, and within seconds, Lyra was surrounded. She raised her hands slowly, the crown still dangling from her fingers, its jeweled edges catching the torchlight and scattering small fractures of gold across the stone walls. "Easy," she said, forcing a small, crooked smile onto her face. The same smile that had gotten her out of trouble more times than she could count back in her home village. "I wasn't stealing it. Look, I even left something in its place." One of the guards leaned past her toward the empty pedestal and found the wooden replica she had carved, a crooked, lopsided imitation of the real crown with a message etched along its base. He picked it up, read the words carved into the wood, and his jaw tightened. "You mocked the Alpha King," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I mocked a piece of metal," Lyra corrected, though even as she said it, she understood how foolish that sounded, standing surrounded by armed men in the middle of the night. "The king wasn't even here. Nobody was supposed to know until morning, and then I was going to explain everything." Nobody was listening to her explanation. Rough hands seized her arms, twisting the crown from her grip, and within moments, she was being marched down a long corridor lined with ancient tapestries, depicting battles she had only heard about in stories told around campfires. She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept walking with her chin raised, refusing to let the guards see how fast her heart was beating. Lyra had grown up in Thornbrook, a small settlement on the outer edge of the kingdom of Vaerith, far from the gleaming towers and marble floors of the royal court. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father, a quiet man who worked with his hands mending fences and shaping wood, had raised her with more patience than most parents could manage, for a daughter who never stopped moving, never stopped talking, and never stopped finding trouble wherever it hid. She had come to the capital 3 weeks earlier with a small group from her village, sent to deliver goods for the Founders' Feast, an annual celebration marking the day the first Alpha King had united the scattered wolf packs into a single kingdom. It was meant to be a simple errand: drop off the crates, watch the festival from a respectful distance, and return home before the week's end. Instead, Lyra had wandered the palace grounds during a lull in the festivities, marveling at the grandeur of a life so different from her own, and had overheard two nobles laughing about how untouchable the crown was, how no one in 100 years had dared even breathe near it without permission. Something reckless and bright had sparked inside her chest at those words, a challenge, unspoken but impossible to ignore. She had not meant any true harm. She told herself that now, as the guards led her through corridor after corridor, deeper into the heart of the palace than she had ever imagined she would go. She had meant it as nothing more than a joke, a story to tell her friends back home about the night she outsmarted the palace guards and touched the crown of the great and terrible Alpha King, a man she had never once seen in person, and who existed in her mind as little more than a legend wrapped in cold authority. That was about to change. The corridor opened into a grand hall, larger than anything Lyra had ever stood inside. Marble pillars stretched toward a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into shadow, and along the walls, silver torches burned with a steady, unnatural flame that cast everything in a pale, watchful light. At the far end of the hall stood a raised platform, and upon it, a throne carved from dark wood and lined with silver, empty for now, waiting. Word had already spread. Nobles and staff members, roused from their beds by the commotion, gathered along the edges of the hall, whispering behind their hands as Lyra was brought forward. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at any of them, though she could feel their stares crawling over her like insects. A tall man in dark robes strode forward, his face pale with what looked like genuine alarm. "You brought her here? To the throne room? At this hour?" "The captain's orders," one of the guards answered. "He wants the king to see her himself." The man in robes, who Lyra would later learn was advisor Corwin Blackwood, one of the king's closest counselors, pressed his fingers to his temple, as though warding off a headache. This is exactly the kind of spectacle he does not need before the feast concludes. Half the visiting pack leaders are still within these walls. "Then perhaps someone should have guarded the crown more carefully," Lyra muttered, before she could stop herself. Several guards turned to look at her with expressions somewhere between disbelief and reluctant respect. Advisor Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied her for the first time, taking in her simple traveling clothes, the dirt still on her boots from her journey to the capital, and the crown still held by one of the guards, glinting under the torchlight. "Who is she?" he asked. "Lyra Ashworth," she said, before anyone else could answer for her. "From Thornbrook." "An outsider," Blackwood murmured, more to himself than to her. "Wonderful." A heavy silence fell over the hall as a set of enormous doors at the far end creaked open. Every head turned. Even the guards holding Lyra's arms straightened, their grips tightening as though bracing for something significant. Lyra felt the shift in the room before she understood its cause, a kind of pressure building in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks. He entered without hurry, without announcement, his presence alone silencing the last murmurs among the gathered nobles. Alpha King Kael Draven moved through his own throne room, the way a predator moves through territory it has never once had to defend, absolute and unquestioned. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in dark formal wear that seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than reflect it. His hair was black, cut short and precise, and his eyes, when they finally swept across the room and landed on the scene before him, were a shade of gray so pale they looked almost silver. Lyra had imagined the Alpha King 100 different ways during her 3 weeks in the capital, based on stories and rumors, and the odd way people spoke his name. None of those imaginings had prepared her for the reality of standing in the same room as him. There was a stillness to him, a controlled power that made the air itself feel heavier, and despite every instinct telling her to look away, to bow her head like everyone else in the hall had already done, she found herself watching him, with open, unguarded curiosity. His gaze swept the room once, cataloging every detail, before finally settling on her. For a moment, nothing happened. Kael simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, his silver eyes moving from her defiant stance to the crown still held by the guard beside her. Lyra lifted her chin, refusing to shrink under that stare, though something about the weight of it made her stomach twist, in a way she did not fully understand. "Explain," Kael said at last. His voice was low, controlled, carrying easily across the vast hall, without any need to raise it. "Your Majesty," Advisor Blackwood began quickly, stepping forward. "This young woman was discovered in the private display chamber, attempting to remove the ceremonial crown. She left a replica in its place. The guards apprehended her before she could escape the grounds." Kael's gaze did not leave Lyra's face. "Is this true?" "Depends on how you want to tell it," Lyra said, and immediately felt several people around her suck in sharp breaths at her tone. "I took the crown. Yes, I wasn't running off with it. I was going to bring it back before morning. It was meant to be a joke, nothing more." "A joke," Kael repeated slowly, the word rolling off his tongue like something foreign and distasteful. "Yes, a joke. I heard 2 nobles saying how untouchable the crown was, how no one would ever dare come near it, and I wanted to prove them wrong. That's all. I never intended to keep it, or damage it, or do anything with it beyond making a point." A ripple of quiet, disbelieving murmurs moved through the gathered crowd. No one, in living memory, had spoken to the Alpha King with such casual disregard for his position. Advisor Blackwood looked as though he might faint. The guards holding Lyra's arms tightened their grips even further, as if expecting her to be struck down at any second for her insolence. But Kael did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply studied her, his silver eyes narrowing slightly, and something in his expression shifted, though Lyra could not have said what it was. "You broke into the private chamber of the Alpha King," Kael said finally, each word measured and deliberate. removed the ceremonial crown that has passed through 12 generations of my bloodline, and left behind an object clearly intended to mock both myself and the crown's significance. And you call this a joke? Put that way, standing in the middle of a throne room with dozens of eyes watching her, Lyra felt the first genuine flicker of unease work its way through her chest. She had planned this in the dark, in the reckless heat of a dare she had made only to herself, without ever truly considering how it would sound spoken aloud in front of the man whose authority she had mocked. Still, she refused to let that unease show. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it was, she said. But yes, that's essentially what happened. Cale descended the 2 steps from his throne, slow and deliberate, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath as he crossed the distance between them. Lyra had to fight the instinct to step backward as he stopped only a few feet in front of her, close enough now that she could see the faint tension in his jaw, the way his eyes moved over her face, as though searching for something he could not quite name. And then it happened. A sudden, overwhelming pull settled low in Cale's chest, so intense it stole the breath from his lungs. It was as though every nerve in his body had been struck at once, a recognition deeper than thought, older than reason. His wolf, usually a controlled and distant presence beneath the surface of his mind, surged forward, with a force he had not felt in years, whispering a single word over and over: "Matate." Cale's expression did not change. Years of discipline kept his face carved from stone, even as something inside him fractured and rearranged itself entirely. But his hands, clasped loosely behind his back, curled into fists so tight his knuckles turned pale. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to remain the king his people needed him to be, even as every instinct screamed at him to close the remaining distance between himself and the woman standing before him in chains of guards' hands, rather than the fate the universe had apparently decided for him. Lyra, unaware of the storm raging silently within him, only noticed that his silver eyes had darkened, that something in his posture had shifted from cold authority to something far more difficult to name. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, suddenly far more aware of the sheer scale of the trouble she had gotten herself into. "Your Majesty?" Advisor Blackwood ventured cautiously, clearly noticing the change as well, though misreading its cause entirely. "How would you like us to proceed with the prisoner?" The word prisoner seemed to snap something back into place within Cale. He straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that had not been there a moment before, sharper, colder, deliberately distant. "This is not a matter to be settled tonight, in front of half the visiting delegations," he said. "The crown of Vayrith is not a trinket to be handled at whim. It represents the unity of every pack within this kingdom, forged through blood and sacrifice long before any of us were born. To treat it as an object of amusement is to treat the kingdom itself with contempt." "That wasn't my intention," Lyra said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. "Intentions rarely matter once the damage has been done," Cale replied. He turned to Advisor Blackwood, his tone brisk and businesslike, though Lyra did not miss the faint tremor that passed through his hands before he clasped them behind his back once more. "Place her in the East Wing holding chamber, not the dungeons. She will be treated with basic dignity until a formal hearing can be arranged." "A formal hearing," Blackwood repeated, clearly startled. "Your Majesty, surely a matter such as this can be resolved with a simple punishment. A fine, perhaps, or a period of labor within the palace grounds. A full hearing would require summoning the council, notifying the pack leaders, drawing this out for—" "I am aware of what a formal hearing requires," Cale said, cutting him off without raising his voice. "I want this handled properly. The theft of the crown is not a minor offense, regardless of the perpetrator's claims of innocent intent. I will not have it said that the crown of Vayrith can be taken and returned without consequence, as though it holds no more value than a festival trinket." Something in his voice, some undercurrent Lyra could not identify, made her study him more closely even as the guards began to pull her toward a side corridor. He was not looking at her the way a king looks at a common thief. There was something else there, something guarded and conflicted, and it unsettled her far more than his anger would have. "Wait," she said, digging her heels in against the guard's pull for just a moment. "Don't I get to say anything else in my defense?" Cale's gaze snapped back to her, and for one brief second, something raw and unguarded flickered across his expression before the mask of composure slid back into place. "You will have your chance to speak at the formal hearing," he said. "Until then, you remain in custody." "This is ridiculous," Lyra muttered, though she allowed herself to be led away this time, casting one final glance over her shoulder as she went. The Alpha King remained standing exactly where he was, watching her disappear down the corridor, with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle with awareness, long after she had lost sight of him. Behind her, in the throne room, Advisor Blackwood turned to Cale, with obvious confusion written across his face. "Your Majesty, I must ask, why the sudden insistence on a formal hearing? A theft of this nature, however symbolically significant, has always been handled through simpler means in the past. The Council will question why you are treating this outsider's prank as though it were an act of war." Cale did not answer immediately. He remained facing the corridor where Lyra had vanished, his jaw tight, his silver eyes distant with thoughts he had no intention of sharing with anyone in the hall. The bond had struck him without warning, without mercy, and now it pulsed steadily beneath his ribs, a living thread, connecting him to a stranger who had broken into his private chambers and mocked the very symbol of his authority within the same night. He had spent years building a reputation as an unshakable, unemotional ruler, a king who made decisions based on logic and duty rather than impulse or feeling. And now, standing in the very hall where he had delivered countless judgments without hesitation, he found himself unable to think clearly, his mind consumed entirely by the memory of defiant green eyes and a stubborn, unbowed chin. "The crown represents the kingdom," he said finally, his voice carefully even. "It will be treated with the seriousness it deserves. That is all." Blackwood did not look convinced, but he knew better than to press the matter further, especially not in front of the gathered crowd, many of whom were already whispering among themselves about the strange tension that had filled the room during the exchange. He bowed his head and began issuing orders to disperse the onlookers, while Cale remained where he stood, staring at the empty corridor, wrestling with a truth he was nowhere near ready to accept. Far down that same corridor, locked into a modest but comfortable holding chamber, with a single narrow window overlooking the palace gardens, Lyra paced the length of the room, her mind spinning through everything that had just happened. She replayed the moment the king had stepped close to her, the strange darkening of his eyes, the tension that had gripped his shoulders, as though he were fighting against some invisible force. She did not understand what had passed between them in that hall, only that something had, and that whatever it was, it had changed the entire course of what should have been a simple, forgettable punishment for a foolish prank. A formal hearing, summoned council members, notified pack leaders. All of this over a crown that she had never intended to keep for more than a few hours. Lyra sank onto the narrow bed pushed against the far wall and stared up at the stone ceiling, her heart still beating far too fast for someone who was, by all accounts, merely awaiting a legal formality. Something told her, with a certainty she could not explain, that this was only the beginning of something far larger than she could have possibly anticipated when she had climbed through that window with nothing but mischief on her mind. Outside her window, the moon hung high and full over Draven Hall, indifferent to the quiet chaos unfolding within its walls, while somewhere in the depths of the palace, the Alpha King of Vayrith stood alone in his private chambers, staring at nothing, trying and failing to understand how a single night could unravel years of careful, disciplined control. Morning light spilled through the narrow window of the holding chamber, and Lyra woke stiff and disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was, until the cold stone walls reminded her all at once. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and found a simple breakfast tray waiting on the small table by the door, left there sometime during the night without her noticing. She ate slowly, her mind still turning over the events of the previous evening, the crown, the guards. The throne room filled with silent, staring nobles, and him, the Alpha King, standing so close she could have counted the flecks of darker gray in his pale eyes, his expression shifting into something she still could not name. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door opened, and Advisor Blackwood stepped inside, his robes immaculate despite the early hour, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested he had rehearsed it. "Miss Ashworth," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I trust you slept adequately." "About as well as anyone sleeps in a locked room after being accused of treason," Lyra replied, setting down her cup. "No one has accused you of treason," Blackwood said quickly, though something in his tone made Lyra wonder if that was entirely true. "The formal charge, as decided by His Majesty, is theft of a royal artifact and disrespect toward the crown. A serious matter, certainly, but not treason. Forgive me if I don't find much comfort in the distinction." Blackwood allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile before smoothing it away. "You have a sharp tongue for someone in your position." "It's gotten me this far," Lyra said. "Might as well keep using it." He studied her for a long moment, and Lyra had the distinct impression that he was trying to solve some puzzle she could not see the shape of. "The trial has been set for 3 days from now," he said finally. "This will give time for the visiting pack leaders to either remain for the proceedings or depart, and for the council to be properly assembled. In the meantime, His Majesty has requested that you be moved to more suitable quarters within the palace, under guard, of course." Lyra blinked, caught off guard by this. "More suitable quarters? I thought I was a prisoner." "You are," Blackwood said, "but His Majesty was quite specific in his instructions. You are not to be treated as a common criminal while awaiting trial. The East Wing guest chambers have been prepared." Something about this struck Lyra as deeply strange, though she could not quite articulate why. A king furious enough to call for a formal hearing over a prank should not, by any logic she understood, also be concerned with the comfort of the accused. She thought again of the way his eyes had darkened the night before, the tension in his shoulders, the strange restraint in his voice. "Why?" she asked simply. Blackwood's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into practiced neutrality. "That is not for me to explain," he said. "If you have questions regarding His Majesty's decisions, I suggest you direct them to him directly, should the opportunity arise." He gestured toward the door, and 2 guards entered to escort her from the holding chamber, though their manner was noticeably less rough than the men who had dragged her through the corridors the night before. Lyra followed them through a maze of hallways, each more ornate than the last, until they arrived at a set of doors carved with intricate patterns of wolves running beneath a full moon. The room beyond was larger than her entire family home in Thornbrook, with tall windows overlooking a private garden, a bed piled high with soft blankets, and a wardrobe stocked with clothing that looked far finer than anything she had ever owned. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in, before turning to the guards with a raised eyebrow. "This is where you keep your criminals?" "His Majesty's orders," one of the guards said simply, before both of them stepped back into the hallway, taking up positions on either side of the door. Alone in the lavish room, Lyra crossed to the window and looked out over the garden below, where servants moved among rows of flowering bushes, tending to plants with the same careful, practiced ease that her father used when working with wood back home. It all felt impossibly distant from her own life, and yet here she was, somehow at the center of it, tangled in the affairs of a king she had known for less than a full day. She did not have to wait long to see him again. That afternoon, as she sat by the window trying and failing to focus on a book she had found on a small shelf, the door to her chamber opened without a knock. She looked up, expecting a servant, and instead found herself once again facing the Alpha King, dressed now in simpler, dark clothing that somehow made him seem even more imposing than the formal attire he had worn the night before. "Your Majesty," she said, rising from her seat, out of some instinct she did not fully understand, given how little she cared for formality in general. "Sit," the Kale said, though his tone lacked the sharp authority she remembered from the throne room. "I did not come to stand on ceremony." Lyra sat back down slowly, watching as he moved further into the room, his gaze sweeping over her surroundings with an unreadable expression. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, evidence of a sleepless night that mirrored her own. "I wanted to see for myself that you had been settled properly," he said. "I have," Lyra replied, "though I confess I'm confused about why the Alpha King would concern himself with the comfort of someone he's charging with a serious crime." Kale's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Lyra thought he might simply turn and leave without answering. Instead, he moved to the window, staring out at the garden with his hands clasped behind his back, in the same rigid posture she had noticed the night before. "There are things about our kind that you may not fully understand, given that you were not raised within the royal packs," he said carefully. "Bonds exist between wolves that go beyond simple choice or attraction, bonds recognized by instinct, by something deeper than reason." Lyra frowned, sensing there was more beneath his words than he was willing to say outright. "What kind of bonds?" Kale turned to face her, and for one unguarded moment, she saw something raw flicker across his expression, something that looked almost like fear, though she could not imagine what a man as powerful as him could possibly be afraid of. "It does not matter," he said, the mask sliding back into place so quickly she nearly doubted she had seen anything at all. "What matters is the trial, and ensuring it proceeds fairly, regardless of any complications." "Complications," Lyra repeated slowly. "Is that what I am to you? A complication? You are the woman who stole my crown and mocked my authority in front of half the visiting delegations of this kingdom," Kale said, though the words lacked the sharp edge they had carried the night before. "Whatever else you may be, that fact does not change. And yet you've put me in the finest guest room in the palace instead of a cell," Lyra pointed out. "That doesn't strike me as the behavior of a king dealing with a simple criminal." Kale was silent for a long moment, his silver eyes studying her with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. "The trial will proceed as planned," he said finally, deflecting her observation entirely. "I would advise you to use the time before it to prepare your defense carefully. The council will not be as lenient as I have been." "Lenient?" Lyra repeated, almost laughing at the word. "Is this what you call lenient? You are alive, unharmed, and housed in comfort rather than chained in a dungeon," Kale said, his voice hardening slightly. "I would call that lenient, given the severity of the charges against you." Lyra crossed her arms, studying him with open curiosity now, all traces of her earlier fear, replaced by a stubborn determination not to be intimidated by his rank alone. "You know, for a man who claims to be treating this as a serious matter of state, you spend an awful lot of time visiting the accused personally." Something flickered across Kale's face, quick and sharp, before he schooled his expression back into careful neutrality. "I am simply ensuring the proceedings are handled correctly," he said, though even to his own ears, the explanation sounded thin. "Of course," Lyra said, clearly unconvinced, though she let the matter drop for the moment, sensing that pushing further would only cause him to retreat further behind his careful walls. Kale remained a moment longer, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made the air between them feel charged with something neither of them was ready to name, before he finally turned toward the door. "The trial will proceed as scheduled," he said again, his voice regaining its formal edge. "I suggest you use your remaining time wisely." He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him, and Lyra remained sitting by the window for a long time afterward, staring at the space where he had stood, trying to make sense of the strange tangle of authority, restraint, and something else entirely that had passed between them. Word of the king's personal visits to the prisoner spread through the palace with remarkable speed, as such things always did within walls filled with servants, guards, and nobles who had little else to occupy their idle hours. By the following morning, whispers followed Lyra, wherever the guards escorted her, curious glances trailing her through the corridors during the brief walks she was permitted in the palace gardens. She overheard fragments of conversation she was clearly not meant to hear, servants speculating about why the famously reserved and unemotional Alpha King had suddenly taken such personal interest in the fate of an outsider accused of a crime that, by all normal standards, should have warranted nothing more than a swift and unremarkable punishment. "He's never once visited a prisoner before trial," one servant whispered to another, as Lyra passed near the garden fountain. "Not in all the years he's ruled." "Perhaps he simply wants to understand her motives before the hearing," the second servant replied, though her tone suggested she did not fully believe her own explanation. Lyra kept walking, pretending not to hear, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She thought again of the strange word Kale had almost spoken the day before, bonds recognized by instinct, and wondered, with a growing sense of unease, whether the answer to the whispers following her through the palace had something to do with whatever he had left unsaid. That evening, Advisor Blackwood returned to her chamber, this time carrying a stack of documents that he set carefully on the small writing desk near the window. These outline the formal charges and the procedures for the hearing, he explained. I would advise you to review them carefully. The council members who will be present are not known for their patience or their leniency, regardless of His Majesty's personal conduct toward you. Lyra flipped through the documents, her eyes catching on phrases like disrespect toward the crown and undermining royal authority, words that seemed absurdly severe for what had, in her mind, been nothing more than an impulsive and ultimately harmless prank. This all seems rather extreme for a joke that hurt no one, she said, setting the papers down. The crown is more than metal and jewels, Blackwood said, his tone gentler than she had heard from him before. It represents centuries of unity between pacts that once warred constantly among themselves. To many within this kingdom, an act against the crown is an act against that unity itself, regardless of intent. Lyra considered this, turning the thought over slowly. She had grown up far from the politics of the royal court, in a village where the crown was little more than a distant symbol on festival banners, its true significance never fully explained to children who cared more about harvest celebrations than ancient history. Standing now at the center of a controversy she barely understood the weight of, she began to grasp, for the first time, just how deep the trouble she had created truly ran. What happens if the council finds me guilty? She asked quietly. Blackwood hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. The punishments for such a charge can range considerably, he said carefully. Exile from the kingdom, extended labor within royal service, in more severe cases, longer periods of confinement. And which of those does the council seem most inclined toward? That remains to be seen, Blackwood admitted. Much may depend on how the hearing unfolds, and on testimony provided both for and against you. Lyra nodded slowly, the weight of her situation settling more fully over her, now that the abstract threat of trouble had solidified into concrete, frightening possibilities. She thought of her father back in Thornbrook, likely worried sick by now over her prolonged absence, and felt a fresh wave of regret twist through her chest. For what it's worth, Blackwood said, as he moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame, I do not believe His Majesty intends to see you severely punished, whatever the formal charges might suggest. I have served this kingdom for many years, and I have never once seen him behave the way he has since your arrival. And what way is that? Lyra asked. Blackwood considered his answer carefully before speaking. Uncertain, he said finally, which, for a man as controlled as our king, is nearly unprecedented. He left her alone with that thought, and Lyra sat by the window long into the night, watching the moon rise slowly over the palace grounds, wondering what exactly it was about her that had managed to crack, even slightly, the legendary composure of the Alpha King of Vaerith. The morning of the trial arrived cold and overcast, gray clouds rolling low over the towers of Draven Hall, as though the sky itself sensed the tension building within its walls. Lyra stood before the tall mirror in her guest chamber, dressed in a simple but well-made dress that had been left for her the night before, and studied her own reflection with an unfamiliar sense of dread settling in her stomach. She had spent the past 2 days reading through the documents Blackwood had left her, memorizing every detail of the formal charges, trying to prepare arguments that might convince a council of strangers that her actions, however foolish, had never been intended as a genuine threat to the kingdom's unity. None of it felt like enough, not against the weight of centuries-old tradition, not against the fear she had seen reflected in the faces of servants who spoke of the crown in hushed, reverent tones. A knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find 2 guards waiting, their expressions carefully neutral. "It's time, miss," one of them said. Lyra nodded and followed them from the room, her heart pounding with each step through the winding corridors of the palace. As they approached the Grand Council chamber, she could hear the low murmur of voices already gathered inside, dozens of them, filling the space with a hum of anticipation that made her stomach twist further. The chamber itself was even larger than the throne room, with tiered seating arranged in a wide semicircle around a central platform. Council members occupied the front rows, distinguished by heavy formal robes, marked with the symbols of their respective pacts, while behind them sat visiting pack leaders, nobles, and other dignitaries who had chosen to remain in the capital for the proceedings rather than continue their journeys home, following the founder's feast. At the center of the raised platform sat a long table where the council would preside, and behind it, on a slightly elevated dais, stood the Alpha King's throne, currently empty. Lyra was led to a smaller chair positioned before the council table, facing the assembled crowd, and she settled into it with as much composure as she could manage, aware of dozens of curious, judgmental eyes tracking her every movement. A hush fell over the chamber as the side doors opened and Kale entered, moving with the same controlled, unhurried authority Lyra remembered from their first meeting. He wore formal robes now, dark blue trimmed with silver, and upon his head sat the very crown at the center of the entire controversy, gleaming under the chamber's torchlight as though nothing had ever disturbed its rightful place. He crossed to his throne and took his seat, his expression carved from the same cold stone she remembered from the throne room, though Lyra noticed, or thought she noticed, the faintest flicker of something else beneath the surface, as his eyes found hers across the chamber. "This council is now in session," announced a stern-faced older woman seated at the center of the council table, whom Lyra would later learn was Councilwoman Odette Marlowe, the most senior member of the ruling council, and known throughout the kingdom for her unwavering commitment to tradition. "We are gathered to hear the case against Lyra Ashworth of Thornbrook, accused of theft of a royal artifact and disrespect toward the crown of Vayrith." Councilwoman Marlowe's sharp eyes swept over Lyra with obvious disapproval before continuing. "Let the record show that the accused was apprehended in the private display chamber of Draven Hall, having removed the ceremonial crown from its pedestal and replaced it with a mocking replica. Miss Ashworth, do you dispute these facts?" Lyra rose slowly to her feet, aware of every eye in the chamber fixed upon her. "I don't dispute what happened," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I took the crown. I left a replica. I intended to return it before morning, before anyone even noticed it was missing." "And why?" Councilwoman Marlowe asked, her tone sharp with skepticism. "Would a visitor from an outer village feel entitled to handle an object of such significance, even temporarily?" "I didn't feel entitled," Lyra said. "I overheard two nobles at the feast talking about how untouchable the crown was, how no one would ever dare come near it. It struck me as an unnecessary kind of arrogance, honestly, treating an object like it existed on some plane above ordinary people. I wanted to prove that arrogance wrong. It was reckless, and looking back, I understand it was a mistake, but it was never meant as an attack on the kingdom or its unity." A ripple of murmurs passed through the gathered crowd. Councilwoman Marlowe's expression remained unmoved, but several other council members exchanged glances that suggested Lyra's explanation had landed somewhere between them, even if it had not fully swayed the room. "A mistake," Marlowe repeated coolly. "The crown of Vayrith has passed through 12 generations of the Draven bloodline. It was forged during the Great Unification, when pacts that had warred for centuries finally laid down their conflicts and joined under a single banner. Do you understand what that object represents to the people of this kingdom?" "I do now," Lyra said honestly. "I didn't fully understand it before. Where I come from, the crown is a symbol on festival banners, nothing more. I never had cause to learn its deeper history until these past few days. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it does explain, at least in part, why I failed to grasp the weight of it at the time." Another council member, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair whom Lyra did not recognize, leaned forward with an expression of open skepticism. "And yet you climbed through a window, evaded palace guards, and successfully infiltrated one of the most secure chambers in the entire kingdom. That level of planning suggests more than simple, thoughtless mischief." "I'm resourceful," Lyra said simply, and despite the gravity of the moment, a few scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd before quickly being silenced by stern looks from the council table. Kale, seated upon his throne, watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, his hands resting loosely on the arms of his chair, though his knuckles had gone slightly pale from the pressure of his grip. Every instinct within him screamed to intervene, to defend her against the mounting hostility of the council, but he forced himself to remain still, aware that any obvious partiality on his part would only raise more questions than he was prepared to answer. The questioning continued for what felt to Lyra like hours, council members probing every detail of her actions, her background, her reasons for traveling to the capital in the first place. She answered each question as honestly as she could, refusing to embellish or hide behind excuses, even as the weight of the room's collective judgment pressed down upon her more heavily with each passing exchange. Finally, Councilwoman Marlowe turned her attention toward the throne. "Your Majesty, before this council deliberates, we would value your perspective on the matter. You were present at the time of the accused's apprehension. What is your assessment of her character and intent?" The chamber fell silent, every gaze shifting toward Kale, awaiting his response. He remained still for a long moment, his silver eyes moving briefly to Lyra, before returning to the council table, his expression carefully composed into something unreadable. The theft of the crown, regardless of intent, represents a serious breach of the kingdom's security, and a disrespect toward the traditions that bind our pacts together, he said, his voice carrying the same measured authority Lyra remembered from the throne room. This council must weigh that reality carefully in its deliberations. Lyra felt something in her chest sink at his words, the faint hope she had allowed herself to feel over the past 2 days, crumbling under the weight of his formal, distant tone. Whatever strange connection had passed between them during his private visits, it seemed to have no place within these walls, in front of the council and the assembled crowd. But Kale was not finished. "However," he continued, and something in his voice shifted, subtle but unmistakable, "I would also caution this council against confusing recklessness with malice. Miss Ashworth's actions, however ill-considered, were driven by youthful impulse rather than any genuine desire to undermine the crown's authority or the unity it represents. A punishment disproportionate to her true intent would serve neither justice nor the kingdom's interests." A murmur of surprise moved through the chamber at this unexpected note of leniency from a king known throughout the kingdom for his unwavering severity in matters of law. Councilwoman Marlowe's eyebrows rose slightly, though she said nothing, simply making a note on the parchment before her. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said finally. "The council will now retire to deliberate. Miss Ashworth, you will remain in the palace under guard until a verdict has been reached." The council members rose and filed out through a side door, leaving Lyra standing alone before the now half-empty chamber, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her more heavily than ever. She glanced up toward the throne and found Kale watching her, his expression softer now that the council's attention had shifted elsewhere, though he made no move to approach her directly in front of the remaining onlookers. The guards escorted her back to her chamber to await the verdict, and Lyra spent the following hours pacing the length of the room, replaying every moment of the hearing in her mind. She thought of Kale's unexpected words in her defense, the careful way he had walked the line between formal duty and something else entirely, and found herself more confused than ever about the true nature of whatever connection had sparked between them since that first fateful night. As evening fell, a soft knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find Kale standing alone in the corridor, having apparently dismissed his usual escort of guards. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door quietly behind him. "You spoke up for me," Lyra said before he could say anything. "In there. Why?" Kale was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as though gathering the courage to say something he had been avoiding for days. "Because the punishment the council is likely to impose does not fit the crime you actually committed," he said finally. "Whatever else may be true, I will not allow you to suffer unjustly for a mistake born of impulse rather than malice." "That's not the only reason," Lyra said quietly, watching him closely. "Is it?" Kale's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, she thought he might simply deny it and retreat behind his careful composure once again. Instead, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly, some of the rigid control easing from his posture for the first time since she had met him. "No," he admitted quietly, "it is not." The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them had yet fully spoken aloud, and Lyra felt her heart begin to race, aware that whatever truth Kale had been carefully guarding since that first night was finally, dangerously close to the surface. The truth hung suspended in the quiet space between them, and for a long moment, neither Kale nor Lyra moved, as though speaking again might shatter something fragile that had only just begun to take shape. Finally, Lyra broke the silence, her voice softer than she intended. "Then tell me," she said, Whatever it is you've been holding back since that first night. I deserve to know, don't I? Especially if it's the reason you're standing in my chamber, instead of leaving my fate entirely to the council. Cale moved to the window, staring out at the darkening garden below, his hands clasped behind his back in the same rigid posture that had become so familiar to her over the past few days. Among our kind, he said slowly, there exists a bond between certain individuals, one recognized not through choice or courtship, but through instinct itself. A pull that cannot be denied or reasoned away, no matter how inconvenient the timing or the circumstances. A mate bond, Lyra said quietly, recalling fragments of stories her father had once told her, tales from the old packs about wolves who found their other half through some mysterious pull neither science nor logic could fully explain. Cale turned to face her, his silver eyes carrying a weight she had not seen in them before, something closer to vulnerability than the cold authority she associated with him. Yes, he said, the moment you were brought before me in the throne room, I felt it. Undeniable. Immediate. A recognition I had never experienced before, and had honestly never expected to experience at all. Lyra sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, her mind racing to process what he had just revealed. That's why you insisted on the formal hearing, she said slowly, pieces falling into place. Why you moved me to these chambers instead of a cell. Why you kept visiting. Yes, Cale admitted. I did not know how else to manage what I was feeling. Declaring the theft a serious offense gave me a reason to delay, to keep you near the palace, to understand what had happened before I allowed myself to fully accept it. Something in Lyra's chest tightened at his words, a complicated tangle of understanding and frustration twisting together. So this entire ordeal, the formal charges, the trial, all of it was because you couldn't simply tell me the truth from the start? Cale's expression shifted, a flicker of something like shame passing briefly across his features. I have ruled this kingdom for 8 years, he said. I built my authority on discipline, on control, on never allowing personal matters to interfere with my duty to my people. The bond threatened everything I understood about myself. I did not know how to face it honestly, not without risking the composure I have spent years cultivating. So instead, you put me through a public trial, Lyra said, standing now, her earlier confusion hardening into something sharper. You let a room full of strangers judge me, question my character, weigh punishments against me, all because you were too afraid to simply say what you felt. That is not entirely fair, Cale said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Isn't it? Lyra crossed her arms, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away, though he forced himself to hold her gaze. You had the authority to dismiss the charges the moment you recognized the bond. Instead, you let this drag out, let the council debate my fate, all while visiting me privately and saying nothing honest about why. Cale was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her words, recognizing the truth in them, even as part of him wanted to argue against it. You are right to be angry, he said finally. I handled this poorly. I let my own uncertainty dictate decisions that affected your freedom and your reputation. That was unfair to you, regardless of my reasons. His admission seemed to deflate some of Lyra's anger, though the confusion and frustration remained tangled together in her chest. She turned away from him, moving to stand by the window herself, staring out at the same darkening garden he had studied only moments before. What happens now? She asked quietly. The council is still deliberating. Does this change anything about the outcome? I do not know, Cale admitted. I cannot simply overturn the council's judgment without cause, not without raising questions I am not yet prepared to answer publicly. The bond between us is not something I can reveal carelessly, not with visiting pack leaders still present within the palace walls, watching for any sign of weakness or favoritism in how I govern. So I'm still at the mercy of a trial that only exists because you couldn't handle your own feelings, Lyra said, though the sharp edge in her voice had softened into something closer to weary resignation. I will do everything within my power to ensure you are not unjustly punished, Cale said. That much I can promise you, regardless of how poorly I have handled the situation thus far. Lyra did not respond immediately, her mind still working through the implications of everything he had revealed. A mate bond, the kind of connection her father had described in old stories as rare, unbreakable, something that shaped the entire course of a wolf's life once discovered. And here she was, tangled in the middle of it, with a king she had known for only a handful of days, a king whose fear of his own emotions had nearly cost her far more than a few uncomfortable nights in a palace holding chamber. "I need time," she said finally, turning back to face him, "to think about all of this. About what it means, about whether I even want any part of a bond with someone who chose to hide behind formal charges, rather than simply talk to me honestly from the beginning." Something flickered across Cale's face at her words, a flash of pain quickly masked behind his usual composure. "That is fair," he said quietly. "I will not push you toward something you are not ready to accept." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame, as though there was more he wanted to say, but could not find the words for. Finally, he simply nodded once and left the room, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Lyra alone with her thoughts once again. She did not sleep well that night, her mind cycling endlessly through everything Cale had revealed, weighing her earlier fascination with him against the sharp sting of betrayal she felt at learning the true reason behind the elaborate charade of the trial. By the time morning arrived, she had reached no firm conclusions, only a tangled knot of conflicting emotions that refused to settle into anything resembling clarity. The council's verdict arrived 2 days later, delivered not through a second formal hearing, but through a written decree brought to her chamber by Advisor Blackwood himself, his expression carefully neutral as he handed her the sealed parchment. Lyra broke the seal with trembling hands and read through the council's decision slowly, her stomach tightening with each line. The council had found her guilty of the formal charges, as expected, but the punishment handed down was far lighter than she had feared, a period of supervised service within the palace grounds, rather than exile or extended confinement, along with a formal apology to be delivered before the returning council members at the kingdom's next gathering. "This is lighter than I expected," she said, looking up at Blackwood with obvious surprise. "His Majesty's testimony carried considerable weight with the council," Blackwood said carefully. Councilwoman Marlowe, in particular, seemed persuaded by his argument regarding intent versus malice. "It is not often that the King's Council sways the council so decisively." Lyra said nothing, though she suspected there was more to the lenient verdict than Cale's carefully worded testimony alone. She wondered, not for the first time, how much influence he had exerted behind the scenes to ensure the punishment remained manageable, and whether that influence stemmed from genuine belief in her innocence, or simply the pull of the bond he had confessed to feeling. "What does supervised service entail exactly?" she asked. "You will remain within the palace grounds for a period of time to be determined by the council, assisting with various tasks under the supervision of palace staff," Blackwood explained. "It is, in essence, a formality, given the relatively minor nature of your actual offense, once properly contextualized. Many view it as a face-saving measure for the crown, rather than a genuine punishment." Lyra absorbed this information slowly, understanding now that her fate remained tied, at least for the foreseeable future, to the very palace and the very king whose feelings had complicated her situation from the start. Whatever she decided about the bond between them, it seemed she would have ample opportunity in the coming weeks to sort through her tangled emotions, whether she wanted that opportunity or not. "Thank you for explaining," she said finally, setting the parchment down on the small writing desk. Blackwood inclined his head and turned to leave, pausing once more at the door as he had during his previous visits. "For what it is worth, Miss Ashworth," he said, "I have served 3 kings during my years in this palace, and I have never seen one fight so hard, so quietly, on behalf of someone he had known for less than a week. Whatever complicated history now exists between the two of you, I do not believe his concern for your well-being was ever insincere, however clumsily he may have expressed it." He left before Lyra could respond, and she remained alone in her chamber, staring at the sealed parchment on the desk, wondering how she was supposed to navigate the strange, complicated path that now stretched out before her within the walls of Draven Hall. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm within the walls of Draven Hall. Lyra rose each morning to begin her period of supervised service, assisting the palace's head gardener with the sprawling grounds that stretched behind the eastern wing, her hands growing calloused from work that reminded her, in small ways, of the life she had left behind in Thornbrook. It was honest labor, and she found a strange comfort in it. A way to keep her mind occupied, and away from the tangled questions still swirling around her situation with Cale. Honest labor, but he kept his distance during those first days, true to his word that he would not push her toward accepting a bond she was not ready to embrace. Yet she felt his presence in small, persistent ways nonetheless. A particularly fine set of gardening tools appeared at her workstation one morning, replacing the worn and rusted ones she had been using. Extra portions of her favorite foods, ones she had mentioned only once in passing, began appearing on her meal trays. Nothing overt, nothing that demanded acknowledgement, but each small gesture chipped away, slowly and steadily, at the wall of frustration she had built around herself since learning the truth behind the elaborate trial. "He's not usually like this, you know," said Fenna, the head gardener, a stout, weathered woman who had served the royal household for over 2 decades and had taken an immediate, if gruff, liking to Lyra's willingness to work hard despite her unusual circumstances. "Kind, I mean. Not that he's cruel, mind you. Just distant, careful. He doesn't let people close. Not since his father passed, and left the crown to him, far younger than anyone expected." Lyra paused in her weeding, curious despite herself. "How young was he?" 23, Fenna said, shaking her head at the memory. "Thrown into ruling an entire kingdom practically overnight, with a council full of older, more experienced members, constantly questioning whether he was fit for the throne. He learned quickly to keep his feelings locked away tight, never giving anyone reason to doubt his strength or his judgment. Watching him fumble through whatever this is with you has been rather remarkable, honestly." "Fumble seems like a generous word for what he did," Lyra said dryly, thinking of the elaborate, unnecessary trial that had resulted from his inability to simply speak honestly about the bond from the very beginning. Fenna chuckled, a warm, knowing sound, perhaps, but considerate from his position. A man who has spent nearly a decade convincing an entire kingdom that he feels nothing beyond duty and discipline, suddenly struck by something as overwhelming as a mate bond, in front of half his court no less. It would unsettle even the steadiest of rulers. Lyra said nothing, turning the thought over as she continued her work, the anger she had carried since his confession slowly softening, without fully disappearing, into something more complicated and harder to define. Their paths crossed more directly a week later, during an evening walk through the palace gardens that Lyra had taken to enjoying after her daily labors concluded. She rounded a hedge lined with blooming silverbell flowers, and found Cale standing near the fountain at the garden's center, apparently lost in thought, his formal robes replaced by simpler attire that made him look, for once, less like an untouchable king, and more like an ordinary man carrying burdens too heavy for his shoulders. He noticed her before she could retreat, his silver eyes finding hers across the quiet garden. "Lyra," he said, his voice carrying none of the cold authority she remembered from their earlier encounters. "Your Majesty," she replied, though the formal title felt increasingly strange on her tongue, given everything they had shared. "You may call me Cale," he said, "if you wish." She considered this for a moment, before nodding slowly. "Cale, then." She moved closer to the fountain, studying the way moonlight scattered across the rippling water. "I didn't expect to find you out here." "I often walk these gardens in the evenings," he admitted. "It is one of the few places within the palace where I can think without the constant weight of council business pressing down on me." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the tension between them softer now than it had been during their last real conversation, tempered by the weeks that had passed and the small, careful gestures he had continued offering without demanding anything in return. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Lyra said finally, "about the bond." Cale's attention sharpened, though he kept his expression carefully controlled, wary of pushing too hard and undoing whatever fragile progress had been made between them. "I'm still angry about the trial," Lyra admitted honestly, "about the fact that you let me be judged publicly rather than simply telling me the truth from the beginning. That's not something I can just forget, no matter how many extra vegetables show up on my dinner tray." A faint, almost embarrassed smile tugged at the corner of Cale's mouth. "You noticed that?" "Of course I noticed. Subtlety was never your strongest skill, apparently." His smile widened slightly, genuine warmth breaking through his usual reserve for the first time since she had met him. "I am better suited to matters of law and governance than matters of the heart, evidently." "Evidently," Lyra agreed, though there was no real bite left in the word. They fell into another comfortable silence, the fountain's soft trickle filling the space between them as Lyra gathered her thoughts. "I don't know what I want from all of this," she said finally, honestly. "The bond, I mean. I've only known you a few weeks, and most of that time has been spent either locked in a holding chamber or working in your gardens as punishment for a joke I never should have played in the first place." "That is fair," Cale said. "I do not expect you to feel certain about something so significant so quickly. I only ask that you allow yourself the chance to know me properly, without the shadow of the trial hanging over every conversation between us." Lyra studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the growing, undeniable pull she had felt toward him despite her lingering frustration, a pull that went beyond simple curiosity or attraction into something she still did not fully understand. "I can try that," she said finally. "No promises beyond that, though. That is more than I had hoped for, given everything," Cale said quietly. Over the following days, their evening walks through the garden became a quiet ritual, unspoken but consistent, each of them finding their way to the fountain as dusk settled over the palace grounds. Lyra learned, slowly, about the weight Cale had carried since assuming the throne at such a young age, the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of a crown he had never expected to inherit so soon, the isolation that came with ruling a kingdom while trusting almost no one with his genuine thoughts and feelings. In turn, she shared stories of her own life in Thornbrook, of her father's quiet patience, of the mischief and adventures that had filled her childhood far from the formal expectations of royal life. Cale listened with a genuine attentiveness that surprised her, asking questions, drawing out details, seeming to find in her simple, honest life a kind of freedom he had never allowed himself to experience. "You've never simply done something reckless, just for the joy of it?" she asked him one evening, genuinely curious. "Never," Cale admitted. "Every decision I have made since inheriting the throne has been weighed carefully against its consequences for the kingdom. There has been little room for recklessness." "That sounds exhausting," Lyra said honestly. "It has been," Cale admitted, something vulnerable flickering across his expression. "Though meeting you has made me consider, for the first time in years, what it might feel like to act on impulse rather than careful calculation." Lyra felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, the last remnants of her earlier anger softening further into something closer to genuine affection, tentative, but undeniably growing with each passing evening they spent together beside the quiet fountain. Whatever complicated beginning had brought them together, she found herself, against all her earlier reservations, genuinely looking forward to their conversations, genuinely curious about the man beneath the crown he wore, with such practiced, careful control. Neither of them could have known, as they stood together beneath the darkening sky, that the fragile peace they had built together was about to be tested by threats neither of them yet understood, gathering slowly in the shadows beyond the palace walls. Not everyone within the palace welcomed the growing closeness between the Alpha King and the outsider from Thornbrook. Whispers of a different kind began circulating through the corridors of Draven Hall, carried not by curious servants, but by nobles whose ambitions had long depended on maintaining influence over the unmarried king's decisions. Chief among them was Lord Garrick Vane, a broad-shouldered noble from one of the kingdom's founding packs, whose family had spent generations positioning themselves as potential allies through marriage to the royal bloodline. He had watched with growing irritation as Cale's attention, once reserved entirely for matters of state, drifted increasingly toward a common village girl with no title, no political standing, and no apparent respect for the traditions Vane held sacred. "This cannot continue," Vane said one evening, gathered with a small group of like-minded nobles in a private study, far from the ears of palace guards loyal to the crown. "A king distracted by sentiment is a king vulnerable to manipulation. If this bond, or whatever fanciful nonsense the servants are whispering about, is allowed to solidify, our influence within this court will be finished entirely." "What do you propose?" asked one of his companions, a thin, nervous man named Osric, who managed several of the kingdom's trade agreements, and stood to lose considerable standing should Vane's influence wane. "We remind His Majesty of his priorities," Vane said, his voice low and calculating. Subtly, of course. Nothing so obvious as direct confrontation, but there are ways to sow doubt, to remind him of the delicate balance of power he risks upsetting by favoring an outsider over the established houses of this kingdom. Lyra remained blissfully unaware of these quiet machinations for several days, focused instead on the strange, tentative happiness that had begun blooming within her, despite everything that had brought her to the palace in the first place. Her evenings with Kale had grown longer, their conversations deepening beyond simple curiosity into something that felt increasingly like genuine understanding between two people who had, against considerable odds, found something rare in each other. The first sign of trouble arrived during a formal dinner that Kale had insisted she attend, despite her continued status as a servant fulfilling a court-mandated punishment. "It will help the council grow accustomed to your presence," he had explained, "and it will give you the chance to understand more fully the world you have found yourself connected to." Lyra had agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable with the formal setting but curious nonetheless about the political landscape Kale navigated daily. The dinner proceeded smoothly enough at first, with polite if reserved conversation flowing around the long table, until Lord Vane, seated several places down, raised his voice just enough to ensure his words carried across the room. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant, "how does a village accustomed to simple festivals and modest harvests prepare its daughters for the complexities of royal court life? I confess myself curious how you find our traditions, given your rather unconventional introduction to them." The pointed reference to her theft of the crown drew a ripple of quiet, uncomfortable laughter from several nobles seated nearby. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to maintain her composure, refusing to give Vane the satisfaction of an obviously flustered response. "I find them fascinating, if occasionally excessive," she said evenly, "though I suspect most traditions, however ancient, could benefit from a bit of honest examination now and then, rather than blind adherence, simply because they have always existed." A few genuine laughs followed this response, and Lyra caught the faint hint of a smile tugging at Kale's mouth, quickly suppressed as he glanced toward Vane with an expression that carried a clear, if subtle, warning. Vane's own smile tightened slightly, though he inclined his head as though conceding the point gracefully. "Well said," he replied, though his eyes carried none of the warmth his words suggested. "Though I do wonder how well such casual disregard for tradition will serve this kingdom, should certain rumors regarding your relationship with His Majesty prove accurate." The table fell silent, all pretense of casual dinner conversation evaporating instantly. Kale's expression hardened, his silver eyes fixed on Vane with an intensity that made several nearby nobles shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I would advise caution, Lord Vane," Kale said, his voice carrying the same controlled authority Lyra remembered from the throne room, "regarding speculation on matters that remain, at present, entirely my own business." "Of course, Your Majesty," Vane said smoothly, though his gaze flicked briefly toward Lyra, with an expression that made her skin crawl, something calculating and cold hidden beneath his polite exterior. "I meant no disrespect. Merely an observation regarding the concerns some within this court have begun to voice, regarding the stability of leadership during what appears to be a period of personal distraction." The dinner concluded shortly after, the earlier warmth of the evening replaced by a tense, watchful silence that followed Lyra and Kale as they finally excused themselves from the table. Once free of the formal dining hall, Kale turned to her, his expression apologetic. "I should have anticipated Vane's behavior," he said. "He has long sought greater influence within the court, and he will not welcome any development that threatens the traditional structures he has spent years navigating to his advantage." "He seemed to be warning you," Lyra said slowly, replaying the tense exchange in her mind. "About stability, about distraction." "He was," Kale confirmed, his jaw tight. "Vane is not alone in his concerns, though most within the council express them with considerably more subtlety. There are those who fear that a king, led by personal attachment rather than pure duty, represents a vulnerability our kingdom's rivals might exploit." Lyra absorbed this slowly, a new kind of unease settling over the fragile happiness she had allowed herself to feel over the past weeks. Do you believe that? That caring for someone makes you vulnerable? Hale considered the question carefully before answering. I believe that any king who ignores the concerns of his council entirely does so at his own peril, he said. But I also believe that a king who denies himself genuine connection in the name of appearing untouchable serves his people poorly in the long run, however comforting that illusion of invulnerability might seem to those who fear change. His answer settled some of Lyra's unease, though the memory of Vane's cold, calculating gaze lingered uncomfortably at the edges of her thoughts as they made their way back through the palace corridors. She did not yet understand the full extent of the ambitions gathering quietly against them, nor how far certain members of the court might be willing to go to protect their own interests. But something about the encounter left her with the distinct, unsettling sense that the true danger to whatever she and Cale were building together had not yet fully revealed itself. That night, alone in her chamber, Lyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind circling back repeatedly to Vane's pointed words and the tension that had gripped the dinner table in their wake. She rose eventually and moved to her window, staring out at the moonlit gardens below, and caught sight of a figure moving quickly along one of the darkened garden paths, moving with the deliberate, hurried pace of someone who did not wish to be seen. She recognized, even from a distance, the broad silhouette and confident stride of Lord Vane, making his way toward the outer gates of the palace grounds at an hour when most nobles had long since retired for the evening. Curiosity and unease warred within her as she watched him disappear beyond the garden wall, and though she told herself it was likely nothing more than an innocent late-night errand, the memory of his cold, calculating expression at dinner made it impossible to fully believe her own reassurances. Something was moving within the shadows of Draven Hall, something beyond simple political jealousy or wounded noble pride, and Lyra, standing alone at her window in the quiet darkness, felt the first genuine stirrings of fear that whatever fragile happiness she had found within these walls might soon be tested by forces far more dangerous than a room full of disapproving council members. Lyra said nothing to Cale about the figure she had seen slipping through the garden gates that night, uncertain whether her suspicions were anything more than the product of an overactive imagination stirred by Vane's unsettling behavior at dinner. But over the following days, she found herself paying closer attention to the quiet undercurrents moving through the palace, noticing things she might otherwise have dismissed as ordinary court politics. Servants who had once greeted her warmly during her gardening duties grew occasionally guarded, exchanging quick, uncertain glances whenever certain nobles passed nearby. Conversations that had flowed easily among the kitchen staff seemed to pause abruptly whenever she entered a room, resuming only once she had moved further along the corridor. It was subtle, nothing she could point to directly as evidence of anything sinister, but the cumulative weight of these small observations settled uneasily in her chest. Her opportunity to learn more came unexpectedly, during an afternoon spent helping Fenna sort through a delivery of rare flowering bulbs meant for the palace's formal gardens. As they worked, a young stable hand named Perrin approached hesitantly, glancing around as though checking for unwanted listeners before speaking. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, "might I have a word? In private, if possible." Fenna, sensing the boy's nervousness, waved Lyra off with a knowing look. "Go on. I can manage the bulbs well enough on my own for a few minutes." Lyra followed Perrin to a quiet corner of the stable yard, curiosity mixing with a growing sense of unease at his obvious nervousness. "What is it?" she asked once they were alone. "I overheard something," Perrin said, glancing around once more before continuing. "A few nights back, while tending to Lord Vane's horses after his return from a late errand, he was speaking with one of his companions, Master Osric, and they didn't realize I was still in the stables. They spoke of contacting someone beyond the kingdom's borders. Someone from the Ashgrave pack, I believe, though I cannot be certain." The name meant little to Lyra, though the careful, worried way Perrin spoke it suggested significant weight behind it. "The Ashgrave pack? They've long held a grudge against the crown," Perrin explained quietly. "Their territory was absorbed into the kingdom generations ago, during the original unification, and there are those among them who still resent the loss of their independence. Rumors have circulated for years, that certain Ashgrave loyalists seek to weaken the current royal bloodline, to create an opening for rebellion. Lyra's stomach twisted uncomfortably at this revelation. And you believe Lord Vane is working with them? I cannot say for certain, Perrin admitted. I only heard fragments of their conversation, enough to trouble me deeply, but not enough to understand the full scope of what they discussed. I thought you should know, given your closeness to His Majesty. I did not know who else I could safely tell. Lyra thanked the young stable hand for his courage in coming forward, promising to handle the information carefully, and made her way back through the palace grounds with her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. If Vane truly was conspiring with outside forces hostile to the crown, the political jealousy she had witnessed at dinner represented only the smallest visible fraction of a far more dangerous scheme unfolding within the palace walls. She found Cale later that evening in his private study, poring over documents related to upcoming trade negotiations, his brow furrowed with concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening immediately at the sight of her, though it sharpened again quickly when he noticed the troubled set of her features. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting aside his papers. Lyra relayed everything Perrin had told her, watching as Cale's expression grew increasingly grave with each detail. By the time she finished, he had risen from his desk and begun pacing the length of the study, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, in the familiar gesture she had come to associate with his deepest concentration. "The Ashgrave grievance is old," he said finally, "but not forgotten, not by those who still cling to resentments passed down through generations. If Vane has truly aligned himself with Ashgrave loyalists, the danger extends far beyond simple political maneuvering within this court." "What will you do?" Lyra asked. "I cannot act on rumor and second-hand testimony alone. Not against a noble of Vane's standing," Leal said, frustration evident in his tightened jaw. "I need concrete evidence before I can move against him, without risking accusations of persecuting a rival simply out of jealousy over your affections." "Then we need to find that evidence," Lyra said firmly. Cale turned to look at her, something like reluctant admiration flickering across his expression. "This is dangerous territory, Lyra. If Vane suspects we are investigating him, he may accelerate whatever plans he has already set in motion." "I understand the risk," Lyra said, "but I refuse to simply wait, hoping the danger resolves itself while doing nothing. I've spent enough time in this palace to know that problems rarely disappear on their own, especially not ones involving old grudges and outside conspirators." Over the following days, they worked carefully and quietly to gather what information they could, Cale reviewing Vane's public activities and correspondence for any hint of irregularity, while Lyra, given her lower profile among the palace staff, moved more freely through areas of the grounds where a king's presence might draw unwanted attention. She spoke carefully with servants she had come to trust during her weeks of supervised service, gathering fragments of overheard conversations, unusual visitors, late-night comings and goings that, individually, meant little, but collectively began painting a troubling picture. The evidence, when it finally began to solidify, arrived through an unexpected source. Advisor Blackwood, whose loyalty to the crown ran deep, despite his occasionally rigid adherence to tradition, approached Cale privately after noticing discrepancies in trade documentation that Vane had submitted for council approval, discrepancies that suggested funds meant for legitimate kingdom commerce had instead been diverted toward purposes Blackwood could not readily identify. "I cannot prove where these funds have gone," Blackwood admitted during a tense meeting in Cale's private study, Lyra present at Cale's insistence despite the unusual nature of including her in such sensitive council matters. "But the pattern is troubling, Your Majesty. Substantial sums, quietly redirected over several months, coinciding roughly with the time frame Miss Ashworth's informant described regarding Lord Vane's late-night activities. It's not enough for a formal accusation," Cale said, studying the documentation Blackwood had brought. "But it strengthens the concern considerably. There is something else," Blackwood added carefully. "I have heard, through channels I would rather not specify, that Ashgrave loyalists have grown notably active in recent weeks, gathering support among smaller settlements along the kingdom's eastern border. If Vane is indeed providing them resources or information from within the palace, the danger to the kingdom's stability may be more immediate than any of us initially realized." Kale's expression darkened further at this news, the weight of responsibility settling visibly across his shoulders. "We need more concrete proof before I can act openly against a member of the council," he said. "But we cannot afford to wait indefinitely either, not if Ashgrave forces are already mobilizing." Lyra watched the tension building between the two men, understanding now the true scale of the danger, gathering beyond the comfortable walls of the palace, danger that had begun, in its own strange way, the very night she had climbed through a window, with nothing more serious than a foolish prank on her mind. Whatever had started as a simple joke had somehow become tangled with threats to the entire kingdom's stability, and she found herself, despite her lack of formal standing or political experience, determined to help however she could to protect the fragile peace Kale had spent years working to maintain. "There must be something more we can do," she said. "Some way to confirm the truth before Vane's plans, whatever they are, move any further along." Kale studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his silver eyes. "Perhaps there is," he said slowly, "though it will require considerable risk, and I am hesitant to ask it of you, given everything you have already endured within these walls." "Tell me," Lyra said firmly. "Whatever it is, I want to help." Kale's plan was simple in concept, though considerably more dangerous in execution. Lord Vane, as a member of the ruling council, maintained a private study within the administrative wing of the palace, a room rarely visited by anyone outside his closest associates. If evidence of his dealings with Ashgrave loyalists existed anywhere within the palace, it was most likely to be found there, hidden among his personal correspondence and records. "I want to be the one who goes in," Lyra said, once Kale had finished explaining his reasoning. "I'm still officially serving a period of supervised duty. No one questions my presence in unusual parts of the palace, the way they might question yours or Blackwood's." Kale's jaw tightened at the suggestion, clearly reluctant to place her in further danger after everything she had already endured because of him. "If Vane discovers you searching his private study, the consequences could be severe. He has already shown a willingness to speak against you publicly. I have no doubt he would act with far less restraint if he believed you posed a genuine threat to his plans." "I understand the risk," Lyra said, "but consider the alternative. If we wait for more definitive proof through official channels, and Vane's plans continue moving forward unchecked, how many people might suffer for our caution? I would rather take the risk now, while there's still a chance to stop whatever he's planning before it fully unfolds." Reluctantly, Kale agreed, though he insisted on careful planning to minimize the danger as much as possible. Blackwood arranged for Vane to be occupied during a lengthy council session focused on trade negotiations, ensuring his absence from the administrative wing for at least several hours. Gale, meanwhile, positioned himself nearby, close enough to intervene should anything go wrong, though far enough to avoid drawing suspicion toward Lyra's activities. The private study, when Lyra finally slipped inside using a servant's passkey Blackwood had discreetly provided, proved larger and more cluttered than she had expected, shelves lined with ledgers and correspondence stretching back years. She moved quickly but carefully, searching for anything that might confirm the suspicions that had been building since Perrin's nervous confession in the stable yard. Her search yielded little of value at first, ordinary correspondence related to trade agreements and routine council business filling most of the shelves. But tucked within a locked drawer at the base of Vane's writing desk, which she managed to force open using a small tool Kale had provided for exactly this purpose, she found a collection of letters that made her blood run cold. The letters, written in a careful, coded hand, referenced ongoing communications, with someone identified only as "our friend in the East," discussing plans to weaken royal authority through carefully orchestrated political pressure, culminating in references to a planned uprising, timed to coincide with an upcoming diplomatic gathering, when the palace's defenses would be stretched thin, accommodating visiting dignitaries from neighboring territories. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she carefully copied the most damning passages onto a spare sheet of parchment, unwilling to remove the original letters and risk Vane noticing their absence before they could gather enough additional evidence to move against him openly. She had just finished when the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her chest. She quickly returned the letters to their hiding place, closed the drawer, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart pounding as the footsteps drew closer. The door swung open, and Lord Vane himself stepped inside, his expression shifting from mild irritation to sharp, dangerous suspicion as he caught sight of her standing near his desk. "Miss Ashworth," he said slowly, his voice carrying none of the polite pretense he had shown during the formal dinner weeks earlier. "I confess myself curious what business you might have within my private study." "I was looking for Advisor Blackwood," Lyra said quickly, forcing calm into her voice, despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "I was told he might be found in this wing." "A rather transparent excuse," Vane said, closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness, cutting off her most obvious avenue of escape. "Particularly given that Blackwood is, at this very moment, occupied within the council chamber, several corridors away from here. A fact I imagine you were counting on, given how carefully your visit appears to have been timed." Lyra's mind raced, searching for some way out of the increasingly dangerous situation unfolding before her. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her growing fear. "I think you know precisely what I am implying," Vane said, moving closer, his earlier polite mask fully abandoned now in favor of something far colder and more calculating. "You have been asking questions among the palace staff, Miss Ashworth. Did you truly believe such inquiries would go unnoticed within these walls?" Before Lyra could formulate a response, the study door burst open behind Vane, and Cale strode inside, his expression carrying a controlled fury that made even the confident Lord Vane take an involuntary step backward. "Step away from her," Cale said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying none of the formal restraint he typically displayed in matters of court politics. "Your Majesty," Vane said, quickly attempting to recover his composure, "I merely discovered Miss Ashworth in my private study, apparently searching through my personal effects. I was simply seeking an explanation for such an intrusion." "The explanation is quite simple," Cale said, moving further into the room, positioning himself between Vane and Lyra with an instinctive protectiveness that left no room for doubt regarding his loyalties. "We have reason to believe you have been conspiring with Ashgrave loyalists against the stability of this kingdom, Lord Vane. Perhaps you would care to offer your own explanation regarding that matter instead." Vane's confident expression faltered for just a moment, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape Cale's notice. "I have no idea what you are referring to," he said, though his voice carried a defensive edge that had not been present moments before. "Then you will not object to a formal review of your private correspondence," Cale said, "conducted properly, through official council channels, rather than the informal method Miss Ashworth was forced to employ given the urgency of the situation." The tension in the room stretched taut, Vane's eyes darting briefly toward his locked desk drawer before returning to Cale's unwavering gaze. Whatever calculation passed behind his expression, he seemed to recognize in that moment that any further denial would only deepen the suspicion already gathering against him. "This is an outrageous overreach," he said finally, though the conviction had drained from his voice. "Built entirely on baseless rumor, and the word of an outsider, with every reason to fabricate accusations against me, given the public embarrassment I caused her during our recent dinner." "We shall let the evidence speak for itself then," Cale said calmly, gesturing toward the guards who had followed him into the room, having positioned themselves discreetly near the door during the confrontation. "Lord Vane will be held for questioning, while a formal investigation proceeds." Vane's expression twisted with barely controlled fury as the guards moved to escort him from the room, though he offered no further resistance, seeming to understand that any struggle at this point would only confirm the suspicions already arrayed against him. As he was led away, his cold gaze flickered once more toward Lyra, carrying a promise of retribution that sent a fresh chill down her spine, despite the relative safety of Cale's protective presence beside her. Once the study had emptied of guards and the disgraced noble, Cale turned to Lyra, his earlier fury replaced by open concern as his hands moved to gently grip her shoulders, checking for any sign of harm. "Are you unharmed?" he asked urgently. "I'm fine," Lyra assured him, though her voice still carried traces of the fear that had gripped her during the tense confrontation. "Frightened, certainly, but unharmed." Cale's relief was palpable, his hands lingering on her shoulders a moment longer than strictly necessary, before he finally released her, stepping back with visible effort. "I should never have allowed you to take on such risk alone," he said, guilt evident in his tightened features. "If I had arrived even a few moments later." "But you didn't," Lyra interrupted gently. "You arrived in time, that's what matters." Despite her reassurances, the danger they had narrowly avoided settled heavily over both of them as they made their way from Vane's study, carrying with them the damning evidence Lyra had managed to copy before his unexpected arrival. Whatever conspiracy Vane had been orchestrating with Ashgrave loyalists remained far from fully unraveled, and the confrontation in his study, rather than resolving the danger, seemed instead to have merely confirmed its existence, while potentially accelerating whatever plans remained still in motion beyond the palace walls. The formal investigation into Lord Vane's activities proceeded with careful urgency over the following days, council members reviewing the evidence Lyra had gathered, alongside additional documentation uncovered once guards were permitted to search his study properly. The coded letters confirmed what Perrin's overheard conversation had first suggested: a carefully orchestrated plan to weaken the Crown's authority from within, culminating in coordinated action timed to exploit the palace's reduced defenses during an upcoming diplomatic gathering scheduled to welcome representatives from several allied territories. But the confirmation of Vane's treachery brought little comfort, given the darker revelation buried within his correspondence. The uprising he had been planning with Ashgrave loyalists was not some distant, theoretical threat, but an imminent one, set to unfold within days, rather than the weeks or months the council had initially assumed they would have to prepare a proper defense. "They intend to strike during the opening ceremony of the diplomatic gathering," Cale explained grimly, gathered with his most trusted advisors in the council chamber, Lyra present at his insistence despite murmurs of discomfort from a few of the more traditional council members. "When the palace grounds will be filled with visiting dignitaries and their retinues, providing cover for Ashgrave forces to infiltrate under the guise of legitimate guests." "How many forces do we believe are involved?" asked Councilwoman Marlowe, her sharp features drawn tight with concern. "Uncertain," Blackwood admitted. Vane's letters reference coordination with several settlements along the eastern border, but the exact numbers remain unclear. What is clear is their intent to seize control of the palace during the confusion, using the crown itself as a symbol of their claimed legitimacy over whatever new order they intend to establish. The council chamber fell into tense discussion, various members proposing strategies ranging from canceling the diplomatic gathering entirely to quietly reinforcing palace defenses without alerting the conspirators that their plans had been discovered. Lyra listened carefully, absorbing the complex political calculations at play, understanding now the true weight of the crown Cale carried, far beyond the simple symbol she had once dismissed as an object of unnecessary noble pride. "Canceling the gathering will only delay the threat, not eliminate it," Cale said finally, silencing the competing arguments with his measured authority. "If Ashgrave loyalists are determined enough to plan this carefully, they will simply wait for another opportunity, perhaps one we are less prepared to anticipate. I propose we allow the gathering to proceed as scheduled, while quietly reinforcing our defenses and preparing to counter their infiltration before it can fully unfold." The plan carried considerable risk, but after extended debate, the council ultimately agreed, recognizing the wisdom in confronting the threat directly, rather than allowing it to fester unresolved. Over the following days, the palace's true defenses were quietly reinforced, under the guise of routine preparations for the diplomatic gathering. Trusted guards positioned strategically throughout the grounds, while outward appearances remained carefully unchanged to avoid alerting any remaining Ashgrave sympathizers who might still be operating within the palace undetected. Lyra found herself drawn increasingly into the preparations, her knowledge of the palace's servant quarters and lesser-traveled corridors, gained during her weeks of supervised gardening duties, proving unexpectedly valuable in identifying potential infiltration routes that formal guards might otherwise have overlooked. Cale, initially hesitant to involve her further, given the danger already narrowly avoided in Vane's study, found himself relying on her insights more and more as the day of the gathering approached. "You have a remarkable eye for this sort of thing," he admitted one evening, reviewing security plans spread across his study desk, Lyra beside him tracing potential entry points along a detailed map of the palace grounds. Growing up in a small village teaches you to notice things, she said. Where the fences are weakest, which paths people avoid, where trouble tends to hide when it doesn't want to be found. I suppose those skills translate more directly to palace security than I would have expected. Cale studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine passing across his expression, despite the gravity of their preparations. I am fortunate you came into my life, whatever unconventional circumstances brought you here, he said quietly. Fortunate, and increasingly certain that whatever the bond between us represents, it is not something I wish to face without you beside me, regardless of how our beginning unfolded. Lyra felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, the last remnants of her earlier anger over the trial's clumsy beginning, fully dissolved now, replaced by a growing certainty of her own, that whatever complicated path had brought them together, she had no genuine desire to walk away from it. The day of the diplomatic gathering arrived with deceptive calm, the palace grounds filled with visiting dignitaries, and their retinues exactly as planned, formal ceremonies proceeding with the practiced elegance the court had spent weeks preparing. Beneath the surface, however, tension crackled through every corridor, trusted guards positioned discreetly throughout the grounds, watching carefully for any sign of the infiltration Vane's letters had warned them to expect. The attack, when it came, unfolded with brutal efficiency during the opening ceremony's most crowded moment, a group of disguised infiltrators attempting to breach the palace's inner grounds under cover of the assembled crowd's confusion. But thanks to the careful preparations undertaken in the preceding days, palace guards responded swiftly, intercepting the majority of the intruders before they could penetrate beyond the outer courtyards. Lyra, stationed near a servant's entrance she had identified as a likely infiltration point during her earlier planning sessions with Cale, found herself face to face with two Ashgrave infiltrators attempting to force their way through a side corridor toward the palace's inner chambers. Years of quick thinking honed through a childhood full of mischief and narrow escapes served her well in the tense moments that followed, as she managed to alert nearby guards and delay the intruders long enough for reinforcements to arrive and subdue them before they could reach their intended target. Elsewhere throughout the grounds, similar confrontations played out, palace guards proving more than capable of handling the infiltration once alerted to its true nature and timing. By the time the chaos finally settled, the majority of the Ashgrave infiltrators had been captured or driven back beyond the palace walls, their carefully orchestrated plan collapsing entirely under the weight of preparations they had never anticipated their targets would have time to make. Cale found Lyra in the aftermath, standing near the servant's entrance where her quick thinking had helped thwart one of the attack's key breach points, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. He crossed the distance between them quickly, pulling her into a fierce embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have of the fear he had carried throughout the chaotic ordeal. "You could have been seriously harmed," he said, his voice rough with emotion, as he finally pulled back enough to study her face for any sign of injury. "But I wasn't," Lyra reminded him gently, though she made no move to step away from the warmth of his embrace. "We stopped them, Cale, together." He studied her for a long moment, something profound shifting behind his silver eyes as the full weight of the day's events settled over him. "Together," he repeated quietly, as though testing the word for the first time. "I do not think I have ever truly understood what that word meant, not until these past weeks with you." Around them, palace guards continued securing the grounds, ensuring the remaining threat had been fully neutralized, while visiting dignitaries, shaken, but largely unharmed, were escorted to safety by attentive palace staff. The immediate danger had passed, the conspiracy that had threatened to unravel years of careful peace, successfully thwarted through a combination of careful preparation and the unexpected courage of a woman who had first entered Cale's life through nothing more than a foolish, reckless prank. But as they stood together amid the settling chaos, Lyra sensed something had fundamentally shifted between them, the careful uncertainty that had lingered since their first tense meeting, fully replaced now by a bond forged not merely through instinct or fate, but through shared danger, mutual trust, and a partnership that had proven itself capable of protecting not just each other, but an entire kingdom from threats neither of them had anticipated when this unlikely story had first begun. In the weeks following the failed uprising, the kingdom of Vayrith settled slowly back into a rhythm of ordinary life, though the events surrounding Lord Vane's betrayal and the subsequent Ashgrave infiltration lingered in conversations throughout the palace and beyond its walls. Vane himself faced formal judgment before the full council, stripped of his title and lands, exiled beyond the kingdom's borders under permanent watch, a fate that Councilwoman Marlowe pronounced with grim satisfaction after weeks of reviewing the full extent of his betrayal. Lyra, meanwhile, found her own standing within the palace, transformed entirely from the uncertain position she had occupied since her arrest that first fateful night. Word of her role in uncovering Vane's conspiracy and helping thwart the attempted uprising spread quickly through the court, and the same nobles who had once regarded her with suspicion or thinly veiled disdain now offered genuine respect, recognizing in her the qualities of courage and quick thinking that had ultimately helped preserve the kingdom's stability. "The council has voted to formally overturn the original charges against you," Advisor Blackwood informed her one afternoon, finding her in the palace gardens where she had returned to her former duties, despite no longer being required to serve any period of supervised labor. Given the circumstances that have since unfolded, Councilwoman Marlowe herself proposed the motion, acknowledging that whatever minor offense your initial actions represented has been more than balanced by your subsequent service to the crown. "That's generous of her," Lyra said, genuinely touched by the gesture from a woman who had once regarded her with such open skepticism during the formal hearing. "She is not without her own sense of fairness, whatever her reputation for strict adherence to tradition might suggest," Blackwood said with a small smile. "Though I suspect His Majesty's own testimony on your behalf carried considerable additional weight in the council's final decision." Lyra found Cale later that same evening, in the same garden where they had shared so many of their early conversations, standing near the fountain, with an expression of nervous anticipation that seemed unusual for a man normally so composed in every circumstance she had witnessed him navigate. "Blackwood told me about the council's decision," she said, approaching him slowly. "Thank you, for whatever part you played in that." "It was simply the truth, properly acknowledged at last," Cale said, though his voice carried a slight tremor that made Lyra study him more closely, curious about the source of his obvious nervousness. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Cale said quickly, then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts more carefully before continuing. "Actually, there is something I wish to discuss with you, something I have been considering carefully since the night of the attack, when I realized more fully than ever before what your presence in my life truly means to me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped object, his hands, Lyra noticed with some surprise, trembling slightly as he unwrapped it to reveal a delicate circlet crafted from silver, far simpler than the elaborate ceremonial crown that had first brought them together, but no less beautifully made, its design incorporating small, intricate patterns of silver bell flowers, the same blooms that grew throughout the palace gardens where they had spent so many meaningful evenings together. "I had this made," Cale explained, his voice carrying an earnestness Lyra had rarely heard from him before, "not to replace the ceremonial crown, which will always remain the formal symbol of this kingdom's unity, but to represent something else entirely, a choice, freely made, rather than an accident of fate or instinct alone." Lyra's breath caught as understanding began to dawn, watching as Cale knelt slowly before her, the silver circlet held carefully in his outstretched hands. "When you first entered my life," he continued, "it was through circumstances neither of us could have anticipated or controlled, a foolish prank that became tangled, through no fault of your own, with a bond neither of us had chosen. I handled that beginning poorly, allowing fear and uncertainty to guide decisions that caused you unnecessary pain and public scrutiny you never deserved. But in the weeks since, through danger and doubt and everything that has unfolded between us, I have come to understand that whatever accident first brought us together, what I feel for you now is no longer merely the pull of instinct or fate." He paused, his silver eyes meeting hers with an openness she had never before witnessed, from the carefully controlled king she had first encountered in that tense throne room weeks earlier. "I love you, Lyra Ashworth," he said simply, the words carrying a weight that settled deeply into her chest. "Not because some ancient bond demanded it of me, but because you have shown me, through your courage and your honesty and your refusal to be intimidated by crowns or titles or anything else this kingdom holds sacred, exactly the kind of partner I did not know I was missing until you arrived, quite literally, through my window in the middle of the night." A watery laugh escaped Lyra, despite the emotion building in her chest, the absurdity of that first meeting striking her freshly, even amid the profound sincerity of his words. "That's certainly not how most love stories begin," she managed. "No," Cale agreed, a genuine smile breaking across his features, softening the careful composure he had spent years cultivating into something warmer and infinitely more human. "But I would not wish for any other beginning, however unconventional, if it led us here, to this moment." He gestured toward the circlet still held carefully in his hands. "I am asking you, not as your king, but simply as Cale, to accept this, and with it, my intention to build a life together, one chosen freely by both of us, regardless of what instinct or fate first brought us into each other's paths." Lyra felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as she looked down at the beautifully crafted circlet, then back up at the man kneeling before her, a king who had once declared her foolish prank the most serious crime in the kingdom, only to discover, through that unlikely beginning, a connection that had ultimately helped save that very kingdom from a danger neither of them had anticipated. "Yes," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion, "I accept, Cale. Not because of any bond or instinct, but because somewhere between that first terrifying night in your throne room and this moment beside the fountain, I fell in love with you too, foolish trials and all." Cale rose slowly, carefully placing the silver circlet upon her head, his hands lingering gently against her hair before he leaned down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her lips, the culmination of weeks of careful courtship, shared danger, and gradually deepening trust finally given full and honest expression. News of their engagement spread quickly through the kingdom in the days that followed, and while a few traditionalists among the older nobility expressed quiet reservations about a match born from such an unconventional beginning, the majority of the court, having witnessed firsthand Lyra's courage during the attempted uprising, welcomed the union with genuine warmth and celebration. The formal wedding, held several months later within the same throne room where their unlikely story had first begun, drew visitors from across the kingdom and beyond its borders, pack leaders and dignitaries gathering to witness the union of their alpha king and the woman whose reckless, well-intentioned prank had somehow led, through danger and doubt and ultimately genuine love, to a partnership that promised to guide the kingdom of Vayrith into a future built on honesty, courage, and the kind of authentic connection that no ancient bond alone could ever fully guarantee. As Lyra stood beside Cale before the assembled crowd, the ceremonial crown resting once more upon his head, while her own silver circlet caught the light beside it, she found herself smiling at the memory of that first reckless night, climbing through a window with nothing more than mischief on her mind, never imagining that a simple joke might lead her, through every twist and turn that followed, to standing here, beside the man she had come to love more deeply than she had ever thought possible, ready to build a life together that neither instinct nor fate alone could have fully predicted, but that both of them, in the end, had chosen freely and completely for themselves.